Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. My guest today is Steve Fazzari, professor of economics at Washington University in St. Louis. Steve, welcome to EconTalk.
Nice to be with you, Russ.
Steve, what is the Keynesian theory of the business cycle? Why, in the view of Keynes and those who follow his viewpoint, why do capitalist economies slump and boom?
The most direct determinant of output, production, employment in the Keynesian view is the amount of money people are spending in the economy, what economists call aggregate demand. So the more spending that's going on, and the more businesses are selling, the more they're selling, the more people they employ, and the more they produce. There are lots of nuances, but at the most basic level, I think that's the message of Keynesian macroeconomics.
And so any change in aggregate demand, particularly a reduction, then would cause a recession?
Yeah, that's right. So the problems we're facing right now, the most direct cause here would be a reduction in the amount of money people were spending on new houses that caused less demand for housing, and so fewer workers in the housing market. Also, the concern that people were borrowing lots of money against their houses to finance their consumption spending. So if they don't use their house as a piggy bank anymore, they won't spend as much, and as a result, businesses that produce consumption goods won't sell as much, and they won't hire as many workers.
Is there a distinction here between short run and long run? Let me give you a scenario that I've often commented on that always drives me nuts, and maybe you have a different viewpoint than I do on it. A lot of people will argue around this time of year, not this year particularly, but especially in years past, that we need a good holiday buying season to keep the economy going because consumers are such an important part of the economy. And I have two thoughts on that, non-Keynesian thoughts. One is, if we all decided to work half as much because we wanted to spend more time with our family or volunteering to help old people or whatever good cause we were passionate about, and we decided to be less materialistic, that would be a good outcome, although in the short run, the adjustment to that new economy would be very painful if it happened quickly. Overnight, we all decided to spend half as much money and work half as hard, but that there's no inherent value to consumer spending. That's my first point. My second point is on that standard holiday spending theme is, if people don't consume, aren't they going to save? And if they save, aren't they going to invest? And isn't that spending no different than consumer spending? So why does it matter that consumers spend?
Well, let me comment on both of those. So I actually have some sympathy to the idea that there's no inherent value to consumption, and we might, as a society, be better off if we were less materialistic and focused on deeper kinds of things in life. So there's some deep philosophical, psychological issues with respect to that view.
And measured GDP would be lower, but
real GDP,
real whatever you want to call it, utility, happiness, joy, satisfaction, could be dramatically higher if we chose that.
Right. So if we had some kind of coordinated policy whereby everybody says we're going to work half as much, we're going to spend half as much, we're going to produce half as much, and enjoy more leisure and more time with our families, maybe we'd be better off as a society. But when you put it that way, I think it kind of shows the difficulty of reaching such a happy outcome in a uncoordinated economy. If any individual, a group of individuals that had been spending a lot decide to cut back, they may be better off. They may see it as themselves as being better off, but the businesses that were selling them goods and services are not selling as much as they were before, and as a result, they're going to have some problems, and the question is, how do you get out of that problem? So think about a family that had been eating out regularly and says, this is crazy, we're driving ourselves nuts, we're going to start to cook at home. They may be perfectly happy doing that, but the restaurants they were going to are going to see their revenues fall, their sales fall, and they're going to have a harder time generating the business that they're used to. So the question is, what kind of adjustment will the economy go through during that period of time? And of course, for our discussion, we can touch on the short run and the long run issues that problem poses.
Yeah, that's why I said, if it happened overnight, that restaurant's expectations wouldn't be met. It would have to lay off workers. That would cause some painful adjustments. So it would ripple through the economy. But if over 10 years we decided to slowly reduce our material spending and slowly reduce our amount of work, I think that would be a different story. And similarly, even in the abrupt decision to work less and spend less, after a number of years, I think we would adjust, but it would be painful in between.
Yeah, I think that's right, that it's certainly going to be painful when it initially happens. Probably the more subtle part of this is what happens over the longer term. How do these adjustments actually take place? I mean, in the broad sense, everybody agreed, like I said, in a coordinated way to work less and to consume less, and decided we were all going to be better off as a result. I think that could happen, or I think that could be beneficial for the economy. But in practice, that will not be a coordinated decision. And what we're facing right now, in reality, with the problems the U.S. economy is going through at the moment, is a decision to consume less, not because people felt like they should take leisure, but because they were financially overstretched, and as a result, lots of businesses are selling less, and then they're laying workers off, and this is a pretty unhappy situation where we end up with people who want to work and want to be earning money in the market economy not being able to do so.
Let's go back to the second part of that fable, though, of this more spiritual, less material world.
Right.
If people spent less and saved more, is that harmful for the economy? I've never understood this distinction between consumption and savings. Surely savings and therefore investment are the engine of future growth. So savings is good. So why is it that savings is bad in that the economy doesn't get stimulated by aggregate demand, given that there's just going to be more spending by businesses in the form of investment? I've never understood that. Am I missing something?
I think you are missing something, but let me... Don't be too hard on yourself. I think much of the economics profession, maybe most of the economics profession, is missing something in terms of this link. This is really one of the most subtle issues in Keynesian macroeconomics. And I can put up a paper or a link to a paper that discusses this issue for your listeners. The problem is this. So think about, again, the family that's eating out in the restaurant. So the family decides we're not going to eat out so much. They might do it specifically because they say we should be saving more. So we're going to cut back on our restaurant spending, and we're going to save more.
It's not this material, spiritual trade-off. Just that we want to eat more in the future. We're going to eat less.
Right. Or we want to go to college, or we want to buy a car, or we want to take a vacation 5 years from now. There's any number of things, but actually there's a direct quote from Keynes' General Theory. It's in chapter 16. I can only paraphrase it now, but it's something like this. A decision not to have dinner today is not necessarily a decision to have dinner tomorrow, or to buy a pair of boots tomorrow, or to do any specific thing in the future. A decision not to have dinner today is a decision maybe to consume some unspecified article in the future. Now that gets a little abstract, but let me be a little more concrete. So go back to our example. The family decides to save more of its income and not eat out as much. But notice what happens immediately when they do that. The restaurant is not selling as many restaurant meals. So what happens to the restaurant? Well, they find their income has fallen. So the decision by our family to not eat out as often forces a reduction in income, indeed destroys the income of the restaurant. Now, how does the restaurant adjust to this? One way they might adjust to it, in the simplest way, and for analytical purposes, is to suppose they keep doing everything the same as they did before. So the workers continue to get paid, they continue to consume, the income of the restaurant is lower, but the spending of the restaurant and the restaurant employees stays the same. Well, what does that mean? That means that the saving of the restaurant group has to go down. So yes, the family that decides to eat at home rather than eating out is saving more, but by exactly the same amount, the restaurant owner and its employees are saving less. And why? Because that decision not to spend destroyed income. So the initial reaction to lower consumption and higher saving by one group in the economy is less income and therefore less saving by another group in the economy. So they just cancel out. And this is, I think, the deep intuition of what Keynesians call the paradox of thrift. The idea that when one person increases their saving, it doesn't increase saving in the economy as a whole. And the reason for that is because higher saving is less spending, and less spending it leads to lower income. Now, I know that's a little bit subtle, but it is, I think, a fairly standard perspective. So for years, as we've worked through Keynesian textbooks and the idea that lower aggregate demand could lead to lower output, behind that result is this intuition that when people save more, there is not actually more saving in aggregate. When individuals decide to save more, there is indeed not more saving available for the economy as a whole.
I think the response to that from us non-Keynesians would be that a couple things. One, that happens all the time in the economy.
Sure.
It's not the case that en masse everyone decides to say stop eating out and eating in, but every once in a while there are such social I don't know what you call them, a fad, a movement, a cultural response. Sometime in the last 20 years, I don't remember when it started, but there was this idea of, staying closer to the hearth, and people started entertaining more in their homes and cooking more and getting into healthy food and all kinds of home activity like that. And that didn't cause a massive dislocation of the economy. It caused things to readjust. Sure, some restaurants went out of business. Other activities expanded. Groceries had more fresh food available and some pre-cooked stuff. So those people, those organizations like grocery stores expanded and did more stuff. And wages of restaurant people may have gone down. Profits of restaurants went down. Other people's profits went up. That kind of creative destruction is going on all the time in a market economy. It's not coordinated. The prices are adjusting to steer the resources to their highest valued uses, responding to people's preferences, et cetera. So my first thought would be, well, that's all normal and fine and isn't disruptive and doesn't cause any problems. And in fact, it gives people more of what they want if their desire to eat out less and eat in more. When I think of the paradox of thrift, is that really what people are thinking about, the story you told, or are you giving us, as you said, a more subtle version?
Well, I think I'm going to give a couple of responses to what you've just said. Let me just directly answer the question you at the end of your comment, which is what are people thinking about when they think about the paradox of thrift? I think the reason the paradox of thrift is so hard to understand is when we individually save more, we see that our bank accounts rise, our stock portfolio increases, we put more money into some kind of financial investment most likely, and we see that increase in our the assets on our balance sheet. What we do not see is the income that we've destroyed elsewhere in the economy by not spending. Income we used to be creating through our spending is no longer there, and we don't see that. And so it's from our point of view, well, the money's still there, it's just going into a different place. But we don't see the fact that our reduced consumption is hurting people elsewhere in the economy. Now, to the extent that we're in normal times, and some people are saving a bit more, readjusting their consumption bundles. Some people are coming into a new phase of life where they might be spending more, maybe borrowing to build a house or things along those lines. There's, of course, always this flux and some demand moving into the restaurant sector and some demand moving out to the restaurant sector. There could be some painful adjustments on a business-by-business basis, but it doesn't end up being a particular problem for the economy as a whole. And as you say, it's a necessary adjustment. It wouldn't be good for us if we were still producing as many horseshoes per capita as we did in 1850 or 1900. So we have to make these kinds of adjustments in the economy over time. And that may be painful in some sectors, but overall it's a necessary shift. But from time to time, and we're in one of those right now in the U.S., we get into a situation where there is some systematic shifts in spending patterns. So what we're seeing now is a reduction in consumption more broadly, again, not because people have decided it will be in their interest to have a less materialistic lifestyle or to save more for the future, but because they're financially strapped. The ways in which they were financing their spending for the past years are no longer available to them. And so we have a systematic reduction in consumption across the board and in consumption across sectors. So it's not just a matter of reallocating goods and services from one sector to another, it's a net drop in total demand, and a significant one throughout the economy. And this is the problem that we're facing. And then the question is, well, what kinds of market adjustments can occur in that context to solve that problem, to bring the resources that were employed in, say, providing consumer goods for people borrowing against their homes that are no longer doing that?
Oh, I'm going to come back to the current situation in a second, but I want to stay for another minute or two with this issue of saving more, destroying income.
Okay.
Isn't it? But what I think that story is missing, at least in the way you've told it so far, is that if we save more and there's a larger pool of money for future consumption, that's the source of innovation and risk-taking and investment. And isn't that going to produce, if it's wisely spent, higher levels of income and consumption in the future if we save more today?
If the premise of your statement were true, the answer would be yes. But the premise of your statement is that when we save more, there's a larger pool of money available, say, to lend out to the business sector. And that's the problem of the paradox of thrift. There really isn't. Again, going back to the simple example, the family that doesn't go to the restaurant as much as they used to saves more. They see their flow into the banking system rising, but the restaurant has less income, and so they're saving less. And under some formal assumptions, those two flows exactly offset each other. So there is the decision by a family not to go out to eat this week or this month or this year and save the money they used to spend on going out to eat does not raise the pool of saving in the economy as a whole.
Okay, now I think we're getting somewhere. So I think what I like about this story that we've created is it really illustrates to me the challenge of macroeconomics, which is thinking clearly about a very complicated subject. And the reason it's complicated is that there's a lot of stuff going on at a point in time, and then we're also trying to deal with a lot of stuff going on over time into the future. And we're inevitably, to make it a story that we can grasp with our puny little minds, speaking about myself, Steve, not you, the way we try to get a handle on it is by holding a bunch of stuff constant and changing one thing.
That's right.
And inevitably, I find that most macroeconomic errors in thinking, again, not by you or me, but by a lot of folks, come in the news and elsewhere, comes from neglecting to allow something to change that has to change.
Yes, I agree.
So what I think is wrong with the story I've told so far is this idea that there's an exogenous outside the model change in savings. I just have an urge to save more. And the reason I mention that is that, of course, that's often caused by something else. And so if I'm going to have it caused by something else, I really might have to take that into account when I figure out the chain of effects that it's going to result in. So let me try the following story and see if we agree or disagree. If we changed tax policy, which of course opens a Pandora's box of changes, but let's, and I'm going to be very casual here, let's change tax policy in a way that makes consumption less rewarding. That is, that it encourages a shift away from consumption today toward consumption tomorrow. A lot of people argue, I think correctly, that the current tax system punishes savings and makes consumption relatively cheap.
Okay.
So if we move toward a tax system that treated consumption and savings more neutrally, that is, that didn't bias the incentives towards consumption and therefore raise them towards savings, wouldn't that yield a higher savings rate today, perhaps a lower rate of output today as a result of that, but a higher output in the future as that savings turns into investment and innovation?
Okay, so the first part of your statement I agree with. That is, if we have a change in tax policy that would encourage saving, say some kind of new IRA initiative, or as many economists have recommended, a consumption tax.
Rather than an income tax.
Rather than income tax, we tax consumption and let people deduct their saving. then if that tax policy had its intended consequence, which is to raise saving, that would cause a short-term Keynesian problem. That would cause the same kind of problem we're talking about as our family deciding not to go to the restaurant as often. Now, how do we get from that short-run result to the long-run result where there is more saving in the economy as a whole? And that has to do with some very subtle issues that have been a core of the debate in macroeconomics, I think, for at least since Keynes. So we're talking about 70 years plus.
Great. Talk
about wage and price adjustment.
Yeah.
So we could go there if
go
that's
ahead.
helpful. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So we have this problem, which is that higher saving for whatever reason in the short term destroys income. So individuals' decision to save more, whether it's from their own change in preferences or whether it's from exogenous change in policy, destroys income. And how does the economy adjust to that problem? Well, the standard story is something like this, that there are unemployed resources as the result of this falling demand, in particular unemployed labor. So if there's excess supply in the labor market, workers who are looking for jobs who can't find them, then that should put downward pressure on wages. And the quick response is, well, then that will bring more, that will lead to higher employment. But remember that when there's downward pressure on wages, if there's still insufficient demand, why should these workers get jobs? If businesses are not going to hire workers to produce stuff that they can't sell. So somehow there has to be a channel through which lower wages will lead to higher demand in total. We have to fill that gap, whether it's with consumption or whether it's with business investment or something. We have to fill the gap in demand that was created by the higher saving. And how can that happen? Well, the standard story is that if wages are lower, then some businesses will cut prices. They can get their labor cheaper, so they have lower prices. And then there may be a number of very subtle effects through which lower prices will stimulate demand. And this process goes on until those resources are fully employed. So the standard story would be something like this. In the short term, we get, when saving rises, we get a insufficient aggregate demand and unemployed resources. But unemployed resources lead to generalized fall in wages and prices throughout the economy that will continue until it's stimulated enough demand that we're back to a demand that will fully employ our resources again. So that period of adjustment that it takes for wages and prices to fall adequately is the movement between the short run and the long run. And this is a pretty conventional view enshrined in, I think, mainstream textbooks now for decades. But it has some problems. Should we go into those problems now?
Well, let me ask.
Maybe you want to explore the conventional.
I would ask a more basic question,
yeah.
which is, I think, part of the source of my confusion over these issues. If I tend to think about quantities, and I think about real resources. So we've got a pool of real resources out there, which include people, it includes output, it includes raw materials, it includes factories, all the stuff that our economy uses and produces. And if we decide to allocate some of that toward, a larger proportion of that toward consumption tomorrow rather than consumption today, isn't that simply going to keep aggregate demand unchanged? In other words, here's my claim. It's true the restaurant's going to have less business and it's going to be cutting back as it would in all kinds of other economic dynamic situations. But isn't the construction firm going to be expanding as there's more savings and there's more as the pool of funds available to spend on investment gets larger? Isn't there going to – now, by the way, what I'm holding constant here, whether we can hold this constant or not, it's an interesting question. What I'm holding constant here is the confidence and expectations people have about the future, which I see as the major source of our current problem today, is that that confidence and trust and optimism isn't there, and people are sitting on their money. But put that to the side. Assume there's no anxiety about the future and what the rules of the game are going to be and what institutions are going to be in place. And instead, simply there's more money available, not more money, more resources available to create factories and creative activity, designing new software or new all kinds of things. I want to get away just from manufacturing. But there's going to be a whole set of productive activities that are going to expand that are not going to be people eating out, which is clearly consumption, but rather people are going to be investing. And isn't that part of aggregate demand?
Well, so your general point of what makes macroeconomics so difficult is deciding what we can hold constant and what we can't hold constant really applies here. So if we're talking about the short run and the initial response to this higher saving, then a very standard fallacy is to think that we can somehow hold income in the economy as a whole as constant. So the basic story that I hear you saying is this. So there's a certain amount of income in the economy. Let's call it $14 trillion, just to be close to our current GDP. And people decide this, some of that's going to consumption and some of it's going to business investment and government and other activities. And now people decide to save more. Well, there's still $14 trillion out there. It's just a question of it's being moved from consumption to business investment. But that's the fallacy. When people save more, we cannot keep income constant. So an increase in saving necessarily destroys income. So there is no additional money in the sense of income flows over time to invest when people save more. The only way to make that happen, to kind of fill that gap, is to have some other process that will restore demand to the level it was before saving fell. That's just not automatic. So this again is the paradox of thrift. You cannot raise saving and hold income constant. That's a logical fallacy.
Well, whose income are we talking? When you say income, you're talking about
income in
aggregate?
The economy as the whole. That is total income in the economy. So, again, our simple example: the family's income might not fall directly, but the restaurant's income falls.
But why isn't But why isn't that offset by the person who is selling the materials that are going to be used for the investment? Because the steel maker for the new factory and the software packages for the new company that's designing new software stuff. Because those activities were never funded. When the families decide to eat out less and therefore save more, so there some money's flowing into the banking system from them. Isn't the bank going to lend that? Bank's not going to sit on that money.
Okay, but that's true. The bank wouldn't sit on that money, but the restaurant owner has equivalently less income, and as a result, will have to, if that restaurant owner keeps his or her consumption the same, will have to draw down savings deposits by the same amount. So the net effect in the banking system is exactly offset. Right, there is no additional flow of funds into the banking system. So as a result of the family's decision to eat out less, that is to consume less, there is no net increase. Right. So I don't see saving.
But there's no. Well, I'm not so sure. I'm a little bit confused about that. But
it's difficult.
There's no decrease in total income then.
There is a decrease in total income. There must be. You might even. Sometimes I tell my students to think about the following thought experiment to try to get their heads around this. And I recognize it's very difficult conceptually, but think about what would happen if people decide to save everything today. People just stop spending. It's silly, but just as a thought experiment to think about the logic, income would fall to zero. If all we had in the economy was consumption, there would be no income.
Right.
One person's spending is somebody else's income. So as soon as somebody spends less, incomes must fall. And this, by the way, is not particularly radical. This is implicit in every mainstream textbook that talks about how, in the short run, we have possible problems in the economy when there's a decline in aggregate demand.
Well, but if we all wait a minute. So if we all let's go through that hypothetical.
Sure.
We're all going to stop consuming, right? We're going to take all of our income, and we're going to try to invest it, right?
We're going to save it. Okay.
Save it. Well, we're not going to save it by putting it in the mattress. Right. We're going to, although we could, obviously, that'd be a different story. That's a whole. That's a whole different set of challenges of what happened to prices, et cetera. But if we try to invest it, save it, and then either using the bank as the intermediary to invest it or us directly, to me, that what I want to do is, again, maybe this is the wrong what I'm holding constant, but if we all decide to work more for tomorrow and less for today, which would be, say, a case where instead of taking my my fruit and eating it, I'm going to plant it, the seeds, and not eat the fruit, aren't we going to get a lot more tomorrow?
Now, there's a very interesting analogy you've just drawn, because it points to another subtle but I think critical piece of Keynesian macroeconomics, which is the difference between a monetary economy and an economy where all trade is in terms of goods and services directly is really very important to this story.
Yeah, I think one of the things we're struggling with here, and we talked about this a little bit, I think last week, depending on when this airs, with Pete Boettke, and that's the distinction between real and nominal. There's one part of economics that says all of monetary activity is just a veil. You got to look at the real side. And the other says, well, actually you can't, because once you introduce the monetary side, it starts to affect the real activity whether you want it to or not.
Yeah, that's right. And so really the key here is that if we are in a monetary economy and working through the financial system, then in this thought experiment where everybody does, basically we're moving along just fine, with some people consuming each other's production and paying money back and forth to generate incomes in that process. Then everybody decides to save all of a sudden, and so income just immediately falls to zero. There is no spending, so there can be no income. That's a monetary kind of system. Now, if we could think about an alternative system, which is think about the Robinson Crusoe on an island, economist's favorite parable. So Robinson says, I've been eating these bananas, and they're really good, but I'd like to actually have more bananas in the future, so I'm going to not eat some bananas, let them go to seed, and plant those seeds and grow more banana trees so I can have more production down the road. Then instantaneously, Robinson's decision to forego some bananas that he'd like to eat today leads to investment that is creating seed that he can then turn into productive banana plants down the road.
Without foregone consumption, there's no growth.
That's right. The problem is making that happen in a monetary system. That when, let me just take another example, if I decide that I'd like to consume less today, go out to eat less, and the reason I'm going to do that is because I want to put my kids through college 10 years down the road. The market system sees that first effect. They see that I'm not going out to eat as often, and will adjust to it. They'll adjust to it by providing less restaurant food. But they will not see my decision to send my kids to college. In other words, the kind of reallocation we'd like to have happen here is that there's less money put into restaurant, or less resources in your term, using your terms, fewer resources put into restaurants and more resources put into providing a college education, training the faculty and building the classroom buildings, etc., to educate my kids down the road. But
why isn't the bank going to lend the money to the college that anticipates?
Because the bank never got the money. See, this is the key this is the paradox of thrift. It's putting all these kinds of things together. So the bank, there is no net increase in saving initially because of my decision to save more, because somebody else's income has fallen. Maybe my bank has got more money, but somebody else's bank, the restaurant owner's bank, has less.
So let me go back to my original asterisk version of this, and let's try it one more time, and then I think we should move on.
Sure.
If we have a change in public policy that lowers the ratio of consumption to income, that is, that increases the amount of savings in the economy as a whole, such a change is possible, and surely I think you would argue that such a change could lead to higher growth and therefore more consumption in the future.
Only if there's some process that restores demand to the level that occurred before the increase in saving occurred. If you can find a way to reallocate resources away from consumption towards productive investment and maintain adequate aggregate demand, those two things together will lead to higher growth. The problem is that they both have to happen, and from the Keynesian perspective, keeping aggregate demand at an adequate level is not automatic. So most modern growth models, neoclassical growth theory, assumes there will be adequate aggregate demand. Why? Because they assume that ultimately that wage and price adjustment process we talked about would work its way through, so that over some horizon there'll be enough demand out there to fully employ our resources. So from that point of view, in the long run, higher saving will lead to more investment, which will lead to faster growth. But some of the more radical Keynesians like myself do not consider that process to be automatic, even over a longer horizon.
Okay, so the issue then, the empirical issue would be, to use the language of the field, the stickiness of wages and prices. Is that the key question then?
Well, in the mainstream thinking, yes. I think the kind of middle of the road Keynesian models, at least in the old days, the question was how quickly will wages and prices adjust so that the aggregate demand problem goes away. That's actually changed some over time. I think the middle of the road now, at least was until very recently, we can't really wait around for wages and prices to adjust. Plus, there are risks of wage and price adjustment, particularly deflation, falling wages and prices for the overall economy that could be counterproductive. So an enlightened monetary policy should step in to fill the role of wage and price adjustment. Hence the idea of the things you might have talked about in your past broadcasts, the Taylor rule or inflation targeting or particular structures for monetary policy so that the Fed could help this process along. Now, of course, and now I'm jumping into the current situation, the concern is monetary policy alone won't be enough. So we might need something else.
Yeah, I'm almost ready to jump with you, but I think, let me just ask you one more follow-up.
Sure.
Given I alluded to this before, given the dynamism of the market economy in good times, not recessions, not depressions, but given that most of the time there's stuff changing all the time, people are changing their habits, their tastes, things are not static. People suddenly get interested in eating out or not eating out. They get interested in exercise. They get interested in biking. They get interested in jogging. They get interested in music. People are constantly responding socially and culturally to all kinds of movements, and resources are constantly being allocated and reallocated to things that people like and don't like via those price and wage mechanisms. So what's the source of your skepticism that things don't work well in that readjustment?
And actually, I would agree with much of what you're saying. In fact, I think that you've put your finger on the source of why the U.S. economy has done pretty well over the last 20, 25 years, which is there has been, I might think of it as kind of an autonomous drive to more demand. And we've also had a financial system that's facilitated it by lending more. And so we actually have had, I think, strong demand growth, and that's worked. My concern is but that's not automatic, that there are particular historical circumstances that sometimes can lead that process to falter, and I think that's what we're facing right now. So my skepticism that wage and price adjustment can solve the problem is really a fairly intuitive one, that while falling wages and prices can have some effects that stimulate demand, they can also have effects that hurt demand. In particular, if wages and prices fall, people who have debts that are in nominal terms will find it harder to pay those debts. So if you have a $100,000 mortgage and your wages are going down, it's going to be harder to pay your mortgage, and you might default, or you might have to tighten your belt in other ways. So that's just one example why a generalized deflation could be a bad thing. And we know that deflation is not desirable. That no one seems to think the solution to our problem now, or the solution to Japan's problem a few years ago, is just to get wages and prices to fall even faster, to get deflation to pick up. And in fact, the Fed's trying very hard to prevent deflation.
I'm not sure that's a good idea, but let's move into the current situation. Sure. Let's foolishly, perhaps, given my earlier comments of holding things constant, let's ignore how we got here.
Okay.
Although we might want to talk about that in a little bit. If you could give advice to the incoming administration for how to make sure the economy doesn't continue to falter, what's the argument for the stimulus plans that you heard talked about?
Well, we do have to pay a little bit of attention to how we got here. So how we got here, but in just a very simple way, is that we're facing a problem of insufficient spending. We can talk later about why that happened, but consumer spending is declining. Residential construction is in a terrible slump. Net exports, that is the goods that we sold abroad, was doing pretty well, but as the economy is slow in the rest of the world, that source of demand becomes more questionable. So there's really no way to turn the economy around unless we can somehow get demand back up again. We don't have enough demand in the economy to fully employ our resources. We need more demand. So how can that happen? The Federal Reserve has done what it can. One way to get more demand is for the Fed to cut interest rates, and lower interest rates encourage people to borrow, businesses as well as consumers and households. They've been doing that. They've now pushed interest rates down to just about the lowest level they can. Ben Bernanke has some creative ideas about maybe lowering long-term interest rates, so he'll probably be pursuing that more or less independent of the administration. But many economists, myself included, now believe that the problems with demand are so severe that we cannot rely on any of the private sources of demand to rise on their own, and that we cannot fully employ our resources without, in a sense, exogenously raising demand for goods and services throughout the economy. And the government can do that. Increased government spending is a source of demand. The government does not have to, because they can print money or borrow. So far, at good credit, they can do this, and that they need to do it, and it needs to be a pretty significant package.
Okay, so
the first, maybe I should be clear, that there's, of course, issues about what the government should do with that, but the basic Keynesian point is less about whether we need more roads or more hospitals or more bridges or more of anything in particular, but that we need more demand in total.
Well, where's that? I'm going to ask the standard question, a couple questions. But the first one would be, where's that money going to come from?
Well,
let's not do the printing, because although that's always a temptation, and it could be the ultimate way it gets done, but let's assume that it gets done the way it's been getting done for the last couple decades, which is it gets borrowed.
So here we have to reverse the paradox of thrift, which is that a reduction in spending reduces income. So an increase in spending will increase income. So that's the basic idea. So in some sense, as the system moves towards an equilibrium, more spending will create the income to finance it.
But isn't it going to be offset by less spending by somebody else?
No, it doesn't have to be. There are various ways we can do it. Probably the printing money in some ways is the easiest one. So let's go there, just because I think it'll be the most clear thought experiment for your listeners. So suppose the government were just to print more green pieces of paper and employ construction workers. Well, those construction workers are going to think of that as income. They're certainly going to see it as income. Those resources that were idle are brought into use. That is the creation of income through higher demand, which is exactly the opposite of the destruction of income through higher savings.
I like this example because it, to me, highlights a puzzle that's been bothering me now for a few years, which is the distinction between Keynesian stimulus and monetary stimulus. So I'm going to think about three things here, which I think are really the same, and I think we disagree on their impact. The case number one, the government issues a tax rebate. They call it a tax rebate, but it's basically just a check on the Treasury. It's not related to whether you paid taxes or not. It's not related to how much taxes you paid. You just get a check in the mail. Maybe everybody gets it, maybe not everybody. That doesn't matter. So you get a check in the mail. This is what we did approximately last spring. Right. I think it was $160 billion.
Yeah, not all of that went to tax rebates, but we're on there. But basically, you're right.
Right. So we could have. The idea was to, quote, put money in people's hands, and you can do that by printing the money, borrowing the money, or increasing government spending, financed by borrowing or printing, and going out and hiring workers to do some, let's make it a make-work project to make it even more dramatic, dig holes and fill them in.
Sure.
Why would that have any impact on real activity? And I don't think it did, by the way. So what's the evidence that it does?
Sorry, where are we now, the tax rebate or the dig holes?
Either one. It seems to me that, well, my first point, which is a sort of history of thought point, is I'm not sure I see any difference between the government printing money and giving it to people, 160 billion worth, and saying, "Oh, I hope they spend it. That'll increase demand and stimulate the economy," versus hiring workers with printed money to go and dig holes and fill them in. The second is clearly considered fiscal policy. The first, it's usually called fiscal policy, but it's kind of monetary, really. I'm not sure what the distinction is. And in all cases, I don't see it having any impact on the real economy.
Well, certainly Keynesians believe that fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus can both affect aggregate demand and have an impact on output. So I don't think there's a deep paradox here, but let's see if we can kind of sort out the ideas. So let's talk about why the policy of hiring one group to dig holes and another group to fill them back in again could actually be economic stimulus. Now, I want to qualify this because this would be a standard trap for Keynesians to say, why are you proposing such craziness? No, Keynesians, certainly not myself, would say this is what we should do.
No, I understand.
But I think
we're
it's
just trying to hold some
helpful,
stuff constant here.
But it's helpful to get to fix our ideas. So if people were unemployed and sitting idle, having a hard time obviously paying their bills, even buying food to eat, and you now hire one group of them to dig some holes, pay them in green pieces of paper, hire another group to fill those holes back in, pay them also in green pieces of paper. They can use these green pieces of paper to buy food and other things they need, clothing, shelter. Those workers are obviously going to feel better off.
No doubt about it.
And so that
they will be better off.
They will be better off. The problem was that before we had idle resources, those workers are now brought into employment. They're going to be better off. Moreover, if the grocers and the clothing manufacturers were also in a situation where they had excess resources, then the spending of these workers who receive the direct government stimulus would help the economy more broadly, and then that would lead to more food produced and more clothing produced, and so now we're producing real goods and services. So, I mean, that's the basic idea.
And what Milton Friedman argued, I think, is that effect would be temporary, that the net effect would be merely to raise prices, that there would be inflation. People would realize then that there hadn't been an increase in the demand for their services, and they would go back to the original equilibrium, and there'd be no improvement.
That certainly is what Friedman would argue, and actually it's a fairly mainstream perspective on these kinds of things. But recognize that at the very least, even with Milton Friedman, that there is a temporary effect, and that temporary effect is stimulative. Now, Friedman had lots of concerns about the practical reality of making these policies work, but I don't think there was necessarily a deep debate about whether, in principle, this could be a source of stimulus for the economy.
I think the issue there was a question of expectations, right? If people were aware, let's go to the even more classic case of the helicopter drop.
Sure.
So we're going to, and the Fed's talked about this in different, not literally, but the equivalent of it. If the Fed goes and prints money and spreads it around the economy, and if no one knows the Fed has done that, and suddenly a bunch of people, you wake up and you find there's a $100 bill on your doorstep, and you think, wow, $100 bill, I'm richer than I was before, I'm going to spend it.
Right.
And they go out and buy a TV, or they go out for dinner with their family, et cetera. That's supposed to stimulate the economy. Now, if they try to do that every week, what Friedman argued is that eventually people would realize there's no increase in the real productivity of the economy, and this is just going to simply lead to inflation. The part that I have trouble with, besides that problem, is that there's a chance that people won't spend it, they'll just save it. Right?
Well, that's right, and in fact, that does make a big distinction between these two policies. So, in some sense, if you hire workers directly to, again, using our silly example, to dig holes, some to dig holes, and the others to fill them back in again.
You can have them bridges.
I mean, that is creating income. That is creating income in the way we measure it. There's lots of wasteful things that go on in the economy, private as well as public, and we count those things as income when it's in our standard accounting methods. If you simply give somebody money, whether it's through a helicopter drop of green pieces of paper or, more realistically in recent terms, a tax rebate, that by itself is not stimulative. It becomes stimulative if people spend that money, and they well might not. And there have been some quick estimates done of this recent tax rebate which suggests that maybe 20 to 50% was spent. So much less than the total that was put out there. So I think this is part of the reason why people who might have been in favor of tax rebates or other kinds of monetary measures as stimulus in normal times say that the problem is just too big now. We can't afford that. We need direct government spending on goods and services, which is a direct injection into the economy. It doesn't rely on people spending what they might see as a windfall from the government.
Okay, and again, I think the what I would worry about there is the inflationary impact of that. And I think that impact's going to be there regardless of whether it's green pieces of paper or hiring workers.
Well, it will be. It will be if, in fact, it works. This is, I think, another bit of a paradox, which is here's where I might differ to some extent from Friedman, although Friedman had very subtle ways of reasoning. So I wouldn't want to put any words in his mouth, but a simple version of monetarism, not necessarily Milton Friedman's views, would suggest that there's basically an automatic link between the supply of money in the economy and the price level. So if money rises, then inflation must rise. I don't see that as such an automatic link. I think it works through demand, basically. So a rise in the supply of money can lead to higher demand. Higher demand will, in some circumstances, lead to higher prices. But higher demand can also lead to higher real production. And why is that? Because if there are unutilized resources in the economy, it may well be that the restaurant will react to the higher demand by hiring more workers and producing more meals than by raising its prices. So the monetary stimulus, fiscal stimulus, wherever it comes from, need not be inflationary in a world of unemployed resources. Friedman and really most mainstream macroeconomists, again, I differ a little bit with this view, would suggest that, well, in the long run, we will fully employ our resources. So in the long run, whether it's fiscal or monetary stimulus, that would be inflationary unless it's offset once the economy recovers.
Okay, well, let's move on to the tougher question now, which is there are differing perspectives on the ability of the government to stimulate the economy. You're more optimistic than I am, and I think you're more optimistic than some. But it's a mainstream view, but not many. I mean, there are a lot of people out there who are arguing now that we need to stimulate the economy.
Yeah, actually, there has been a remarkable shift
through increase,
not only to some stimulus, but to massive stimulus.
Now, I don't want to suggest that that stimulus is going to be spent on digging holes and filling them back in. I think there's going to be a lot of, quote, productive things produced. What I'm more worried about is two things, that many of those productive things are going to be still less productive than alternatives that might have been produced by private sector activity. And the thing I worry about more, besides this worry that it doesn't stimulate at all because of offsetting effects either of inflation or lost investment. What I worry about more is what I see, and we haven't mentioned this, the investment climate, which is people are fearful of the future.
Right.
Part of the reason they're fearful is they just think the economy is going to go down. Part of the reason they're fearful of the future is that they're not sure what the rules of the game are going to be. They're not sure who's going to get bailed out and who's not going to get bailed out. And so many risk takers, almost all right now, are sitting on the sidelines saying, I'm going to wait and see till stuff settles down. And that attitude is pervasive. It's not just being held by an attitude by banks. It's an attitude that most of us have individually who are saying, gee, I might not have a job in 6 months. I might not have a job in a year. I'm not going to buy the new TV. I'm not going to buy the fancy gadget. I'm not going to buy the new car. I'm going to get by with what I have. And as a result, people are very fearful. And as even worse than that, they're cutting back to make sure that they're in a position, if things get worse, to weather the storm. So I don't see any evidence that this kind of stimulus package is going to change. And if anything, I think it's going to make it worse because of rent seeking. I don't see any evidence that this stimulus package is going to change people's expectations. So talk generally then about the evidence that we have. Mine's a surmise. what empirical evidence do we have that this kind of stimulus that many, many people are advocating, massive increases in government spending and in the government deficit, will have a stimulative effect on the economy as a whole?
Well, that's a good question, and you said a lot of interesting things. I might just mention as a sidelight before I answer your question directly that you made a very good Keynesian argument in some sense about what Keynes called animal spirits, that weak expectations and fear about the future can lead to a depressed economy is indeed a very Keynesian kind of argument. But let's go back to the more direct question and say, well, what evidence is there that government stimulus in particular can help turn economic circumstances around? The example that probably most people would point to most immediately is World War II. There's some debate about whether World War II pulled the economy out of the Depression. I've looked at some of that literature, and I would basically argue that yes, that the military production at the end of the 30s and then ultimately World War II was key to getting the economy out of the Depression. But I think there can be very little debate about the fact that World War II itself stimulated production. I mean, the economy grew at remarkable rates. Unemployment fell to virtually zero. Lots of incomes were created. There was a huge government deficit. So the economy was stimulated. It's less of an issue about whether it was this was the reason we got out of the Depression. The economy was stimulated during that period. In fact, this general idea of wartime economy, World War II is the most dramatic example that I'm aware of in recent times. But if we think about Korea or Vietnam, also relatively large spending periods of time. These were also periods of fairly quick economic growth and low unemployment. Let's talk about the Vietnam era in particular, when there was worry about the economy overheating, and there was worry about inflation created in the late 1960s because there was so much government stimulus. We were probably getting to the point where we were fully employing, maybe overemploying our resources, and there was a worry about inflation. Another example I might give is the Reagan tax cuts of the early 1980s. So the economy was in a pretty deep problem at that point in time. The highest unemployment rate since the Depression, 10.8% in late 1982. And during this period of time, there were these massive tax cuts, in this case permanent tax cuts that people would not expect to be rescinded, not just a one-time rebate. Now, there's debate about the effects, but in some recent research I've done, interestingly, this is the beginning of a consumption boom period. The idea of the tax cuts was actually to stimulate saving, among other things. But in practice, it seemed like a lot of it went into higher consumption. And the economy did reasonably well, not just in the 80s, but with these relatively low tax rates through the 90s and even much of this decade. So the problem with these things is they're all rather anecdotal. There are alternative stories to be told that as economists, we just don't have much of a database. We can say, well, we have hundreds of quarterly observations on GDP and other kinds of variables over the past 50 or 60 years, but as a practical matter, we just have a few historical periods in which these kinds of things were attempted. We can't rerun those histories with different policies and see what would be different. So it really is very difficult to have hard evidence for any of these perspectives.
Yeah, just as a footnote, regular listeners will remember that our podcast with Robert Higgs argued that the wartime prosperity was an illusion, that measurement of economic activity is very difficult during the war due to wage and price controls, and that while the war was good for reducing unemployment by conscripting people and by encouraging military production, that it didn't stimulate the economy. It still stimulated the military side. And I understand that's a controversial view.
Yeah, Professor Higgs is on the other side of that issue, and he's made a coherent argument.
Right.
And while I disagree with that particular perspective, I would say it's indicative of the broader point, which is it's going to be very difficult to say, let's look at the evidence and decide which view is right. Okay. We'll look at the evidence, and we'll have people debate about what the evidence means.
So let me ask you a hard question.
Okay.
We'll close with this as a philosophical question. As you say, and I think it's a profoundly important point, it's very difficult to measure these effects in a systematic way because it's a complex system. Many things are changing at one time. We can't rerun the experiment with an alternative stimulus or a lack of stimulus. So it's very difficult to know which of these impacts are real versus illusory. It's very tempting to construct ex post narratives about the Great Depression or the current financial mess or the Vietnam or Reagan eras. And as you say, that when you say they were anecdotal, you were trying to be modest. It's true they're anecdotal. They're a little more than anecdotal.
Yeah.
You've got to try to...
I guess I should say they were historically specific. They're really kind of one observation.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest challenge that macroeconomics faces. Is that often we're trying to explain one observation, and then another observation comes along with its own unique circumstances. So as a professor and as a professional economist, what are your thoughts on how a person should confront this challenge? That is, you were trained a certain way, I was trained a certain way. I think your PhD work was at Stanford, correct? And so I went to Chicago, and I drank a certain kind of milk there, and you drank a different kind of milk from your intellectual mothers there. And how do we keep our intellectual honesty in a world where a lot of perhaps what we believe in is, I don't know what you want to call it. I don't want to call it bias. I don't think it's a bias, but how easy it is to confirm our priors with the empirical stories we're able to tell.
Well, that's an excellent question, and you're right. It's a very difficult one. So let me just share some of my views on that. It's something I've thought about a lot over my career. I think part of it is to be serious about the evidence. So even though I recognize the difficulty of validating one's own theories or any theory with hard empirical evidence, we just don't have the luxury that many of the natural sciences have of doing controlled experiments or having very, very detailed observations on an unchanging universe to draw evidence for our theories. But we still should try. That might mean looking at just a piece of the theory, not the theory as a whole necessarily, and trying to work that, do what you can in some respects. I do think it suggests, especially in macroeconomics, an openness to a more historical style of analysis. Economics has tended to focus on formal statistical methods that require lots of data. Maybe we need to look more at case studies, at economic history. Professor Higgs is a good example of that. And try to get our evidence there. In some ways, I think we have to be humble. That is, we're not going to be able to find the critical experiments that will necessarily distinguish between these theories. And so we have to be aggressive and work hard to get what evidence we can. I also think that we need to be guided by theory in some respects. But we need to be open-minded about those theories. I think too many of us come into these problems with a somewhat closed-minded view about how the world works, and just are not interested in hearing the alternative stories. And I think that's difficult. While I have come to the conclusion over a quarter century plus of research and teaching on these areas that the Keynesian perspective is the best way to understand the macroeconomy, I've also tried to be very open to the alternatives and understand very clearly the alternatives. I don't think that's something that's necessarily broadly true in our profession, where, as you say, we all drink a particular kind of milk and
Kool-Aid maybe is the right word. I said milk, but it might be Kool-Aid.
Yeah, and stick with it. So I think we have to be a bit humble about this, and I could maybe just make a quick comment with respect to what's going on right now. A lot of people are critical. I am too, somewhat of the somewhat haphazard way that economic policy is being done right now, but I have a certain sympathy for it. People like Hank Paulson and Ben Bernanke and President-elect Obama and Paul Volcker and Larry Summers and Austin Goolsbee and the economic leaders that we have and are about to have a very, very difficult job. They can't afford to debate about is the world Keynesian or non-Keynesian. They have to come up with policies that affect people's lives now. And so we have to expect a certain amount of starting and stopping. And I mean, in the broad sense, your concern about expectations is well taken, that people may have not a whole lot of confidence in their economic leaders when this is happening, but we have to recognize that this is the state of knowledge in our profession.
Yeah, it's very, 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 very well said. And I have to say that my own mood has tended toward humility in the last 6 to 18 months as we've seen things happen. I think we're, as a profession, in a very strange situation where we really are struggling, I think, to understand this as well as we thought we could. And although we can't run natural experiments, we're about to get as close to it as you can come. If we have $1 trillion stimulus package, which some people are talking about, we are going to learn something, I think. We may debate it and argue about what it actually means, but I have a feeling we're about to embark on something that will be, at a minimum, very educational. I hope it's more than that, but we'll find out.
Well, on that point, we can certainly agree.
My guest today has been Steve Fazzari, professor of economics at Washington University in St. Louis. Steve, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
It's been my pleasure, Russ.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.